There is a description of a tumor written on papyrus. It is approximately 3,500 years old. The ink has survived the Egyptian desert in a way that almost nothing else survives, preserved by dryness and darkness and the particular indifference of time to things that are simply waiting to be found. The writing is careful, precise, the handwriting of a physician who understood that what he was recording mattered and was paying attention to that fact. The description is clinical. The size of the growth, its texture, its behavior over time, the way it resisted treatment, the way it spread. And then, at the end of the entry, after all the careful clinical observation, the physician writes something that stops every modern reader who encounters it. He writes, "There is no treatment." Not, "We have not found a treatment yet." Not, "The treatment is unknown to us." Just, "There is no treatment," as if the thing he was describing existed outside the category of problems that medicine was equipped to address, as if it belonged to a different order of reality entirely. He was right, for his era. But the question that entry raises is not medical, it is psychological. If there is no treatment, and the condition is real, and it is happening to a person you are trying to help, then what do you tell them? What framework do you offer? What story do you construct around something that your entire medical system has just declared beyond its reach? Human beings do not cope well with meaninglessness. This is one of the most thoroughly documented facts about our species. We are meaning-making creatures. We look at random patterns and see faces. We look at unconnected events and find narratives. We take the raw chaos of experience and we organize it into stories that make it survivable, that give it shape and cause, and sometimes even purpose. And so when something as terrible and as mysterious as cancer appeared in a human body, and when the physicians and the priests and the philosophers of that era could not explain it in terms of their existing frameworks, they did what humans always do when existing frameworks fail. They built new ones. The frameworks they built were wrong. Almost all of them were wrong, in ways that seem, from our current vantage point, somewhere between poignant and almost unbearably sad. They were wrong about the cause, wrong about the treatment, wrong about who was vulnerable and why, wrong about what the disease meant and what it said about the person it was happening to. But they were not stupid. This is the thing that gets lost when we look back at historical medical thinking from the comfortable position of modern knowledge. The people who developed these frameworks were not primitive or credulous or incapable of rational thought. Many of them were among the most intelligent and careful observers of their eras. They were working with the information they had, applying the most sophisticated analytical tools available to them, and arriving at conclusions that were internally consistent and often elegantly reasoned. They were just wrong. And the story of how they were wrong, specifically how and why, and what the wrongness looked like from the inside of each era that believed it, is one of the most revealing stories in the history of human thought. Because it is not really a story about cancer. It is a story about how the human mind confronts the things it cannot explain, about the specific shapes that explanation takes when the true answer is not yet available, about the remarkable consistency with which different cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, arrived at similar wrong answers because they were all working with the same human cognitive equipment and the same deep need to make the incomprehensible comprehensible. And about something else, too. Something that only becomes visible when you trace the whole arc, from the Egyptian papyrus, to the medieval humors, to the Victorian theories of emotional suppression. Medieval humors, to the Victorian theories of emotional suppression, to the moment in the 20th century when the actual mechanisms finally began to come into focus. Something hopeful, because the story of how people explained cancer before they understood it is not, ultimately, a story about failure. It is a story about persistence, about the refusal, across 35 centuries of wrong answers, to stop asking the question, about the particular stubbornness of the human mind that keeps building frameworks even when the frameworks keep collapsing, keeps reaching for understanding even when understanding keeps retreating just beyond the fingertips. Every wrong answer was a step, not toward the right answer specifically. The path was not that clean, but toward the accumulation of observations and the elimination of possibilities and the slow, painful refinement of the question itself, which turned out to be more important than any individual answer. The Egyptian physician who wrote, "There is no treatment," was not giving up. He was drawing a line. On this side, the things we can help. On that side, the things we cannot help yet. The line was honest. The line was precise. And the existence of the line meant that everyone who came after him knew where to start. They started at the line, and they pushed it, slowly, imperfectly, across millennia, with tools that got better so gradually that the improvement was invisible to any single generation. They pushed it. This is that story. The word cancer means crab. This is not a metaphor that a modern marketing team would have chosen. It is not inspirational or clinical or abstract. It is specific and visual and slightly uncomfortable, which is exactly why Hippocrates chose it 2,400 years ago. He was looking at a tumor. The tumor had a central mass with extensions reaching outward into the surrounding tissue, and the extensions reminded him of the legs of a crab. Not a poetic crab, not a symbolic crab, but a real crab, the kind you might find in the harbour at Kos, the Greek island where Hippocrates practiced medicine and taught students and built the foundation of Western medical thought. He called it karkinos, the Greek word for crab. The name stuck. It moved from Greek into Latin as cancer. It moved from Latin into every European language. It is still the word we use today, 24 centuries later. Because no one has ever come up with a better one, and because the image, once you have seen it, is difficult to replace. But Hippocrates did more than name the disease. He explained it. And his explanation, which was wrong in every particular, was so elegant and so internally consistent that it dominated medical thinking for nearly 2,000 years. The explanation was based on humors. The humoral system, which Hippocrates either developed or formalized from earlier Greek medical thinking, proposed that the human body contained 4 fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was balance. When the four humours existed in proper proportion, the body functioned correctly. Disease was imbalance. When one humour accumulated in excess or was deficient, the body malfunctioned in specific ways that corresponded to the specific humour that was out of balance. Each humour had associated qualities. Blood was hot and wet. Phlegm was cold and wet. Yellow bile was hot and dry. Black bile was cold and dry. Each humour had associated temperaments. Excess blood made a person sanguine, cheerful, and energetic. Excess phlegm made a person phlegmatic, calm, and slow. Excess yellow bile made a person choleric, irritable, and aggressive. Excess black bile made a person melancholic, sad, and withdrawn. These terms survive in modern English. We still call happy people sanguine and calm people phlegmatic. The humoral system is so deeply embedded in Western language that we use its vocabulary without knowing where it came from. Cancer, in the Hippocratic framework, was a disease of black bile. The logic was straightforward. Tumours were dark in colour, or at least darker than the surrounding tissue. They were cold to the touch in many cases. They were associated with older patients, who were understood to have naturally higher levels of black bile as the body cooled and dried with age. And cancer was associated with melancholy, with sadness and withdrawal, which were the emotional signatures of black bile excess. Therefore, cancer was what happened when black bile accumulated in a specific location in the body, pooling and thickening, and eventually solidifying into a mass that grew and spread as more black bile was drawn to the site. This was wrong, but notice how reasonable it was. The physician observed real things. Tumours were often dark. They were more common in older people. Patients with serious illness were often sad. These were genuine observations, accurately recorded. The error was not in the observation, but in the framework used to connect the observations, the causal story that linked them together into an explanation. The framework said that the darkness and the sadness and the age were all manifestations of the same underlying cause, black bile. Too much of it in the wrong place, doing what black bile does when it accumulates. The framework was wrong, but it was not arbitrary. It was a serious intellectual attempt to find a unified explanation for a set of observations that genuinely did co-occur, and it was constructed by people who were, by the standards of their era, rigorous and systematic thinkers. Hippocrates himself was cautious about treatment. He recognized that cutting into tumours often made them worse, that the disease frequently returned after apparent removal, and that many interventions caused more suffering than the disease itself. His advice, in cases of deep or advanced cancer, was remarkably similar to the Egyptian physician's assessment 1500 years earlier. Do not treat it. Leave it alone. The patient will live longer with the disease than with the treatment. This was, for many types of cancer, excellent advice. that would remain excellent advice for the next 2 millennia. The treatments available, which ranged from cauterization to herbal poultices to bleeding to reduce the excess black bile, were in most cases worse than the disease. Hippocrates understood this through direct observation, and his willingness to say so honestly is one of the things that distinguishes him from many of the physicians who came after him and were less comfortable with the admission of helplessness. Galen, who practiced in Rome in the 2nd century AD, and whose medical writings became the dominant authority in Western medicine for over 1,000 years, built on Hippocrates' humoral theory, but was considerably less cautious about treatment. Galen believed that black bile could be purged from the body through diet, medication, and bleeding. He recommended specific dietary changes designed to reduce black bile production. He prescribed purgatives intended to flush excess black bile from the system. He recommended bleeding from specific veins that he believed were connected to the sites where black bile accumulated. Galen was a brilliant physician in many respects. His anatomical observations were detailed and often accurate. His understanding of the circulatory system was incomplete but sophisticated for his era. His clinical skills were, by all accounts, extraordinary. His cancer theory was still wrong, but it was wrong in a way that felt right. It offered a mechanism. It offered a cause. It offered, most importantly, something to do. The Hippocratic advice of "do not treat" was psychologically unbearable for many physicians and many patients. Galen's system offered action, diet changes and medications and bleeding schedules, a protocol that could be followed, a sense of agency in the face of a disease that otherwise stripped agency away entirely. The human need for agency is enormous. It is, perhaps, even larger than the need for accuracy. People would rather do the wrong thing than do nothing, because doing nothing feels like surrender, and doing something, even something useless, feels like fighting. This psychological reality shaped cancer treatment for centuries. Galen's treatments did not work. They sometimes made things worse, but they gave patients and physicians a narrative of active engagement with the disease, and that narrative was, psychologically, more survivable than the honest Hippocratic admission that there was nothing useful to be done. The humoral theory persisted because it was useful in this psychological sense, even when it was useless in the medical sense. It gave people a story. And humans need stories more than they need accuracy, especially when the accurate story is, we do not know what this is, we do not know what causes it, and we cannot help you. That story is true, but it is not livable. The humoral story was livable. It had causes and treatments and things you could do and ways you could understand what was happening to you. It was a complete narrative with a beginning and a middle and at least the possibility of an end that was not simply death arriving on its own schedule. It was wrong, but it was a place to stand, and for 2,000 years it was the only place available. The medieval church did not invent the idea that disease was punishment. The idea was already ancient by the time Christianity became the dominant framework for understanding the world in Europe. The Old Testament contains numerous passages linking illness to divine displeasure. The book of Job which is essentially a sustained philosophical argument about whether suffering implies guilt, exists precisely because the assumption it was arguing against was already widespread and deeply rooted. The assumption was simple. Bad things happen to bad people. Good things happen to good people. Therefore, if a bad thing is happening to you, you must have done something to deserve it. This logic is so deeply embedded in human cognition that psychologists have given it a name. They call it the just world hypothesis, the tendency to believe that the world is fundamentally fair and that outcomes correspond to merit. It appears in every culture that has been studied. It appears in children before they are old enough to have learned it from adults. It appears to be, as far as researchers can determine, a default setting of the human mind, something the brain does automatically unless it is deliberately overridden by education or experience. The just world hypothesis is psychologically useful. It makes the world feel predictable. If bad things happen because of bad behavior, then you can protect yourself by behaving well. The universe becomes manageable. Cause and effect operate in a way that gives you agency. You are not helpless in the face of random catastrophe, because catastrophe is not random. It is earned. The cost of this psychological comfort is paid by the person who is suffering, because if bad things happen to bad people, then the person with cancer has done something wrong, something specific, something identifiable, something that, if it could be named and confessed and atoned for, might reverse the disease that had come as its consequence. The medieval church took this pre-existing human tendency and gave it theological structure. Disease was understood within a framework that included sin, divine will, demonic influence, and the mysterious but purposeful plan of a God who is simultaneously all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving. Reconciling those three qualities with the existence of terrible suffering was the central intellectual challenge of medieval theology, and the solutions that were developed had direct and practical consequences for how sick people were understood and treated. The first solution was the punishment model. Cancer was a punishment for specific sins. The nature of the sin could sometimes be deduced from the location of the disease, following a symbolic logic that connected body parts to particular moral failings. This is difficult territory to discuss in detail without being indelicate, but the general principle was that the body was understood as a moral map, and disease in a particular region indicated transgression associated with that region. A growth in the throat might indicate sins of speech, gossip, blasphemy, false testimony. A growth in the stomach might indicate sins of appetite, gluttony, greed, excessive attachment to worldly pleasure. The specifics varied by region and century and the particular theological tradition of the priest or physician offering the interpretation, but the underlying logic was consistent. The body spoke. Disease was its language, and the message was moral. The second solution was the testing model. This was the Job framework. God was not punishing the sufferer, but testing them. The disease was an opportunity to demonstrate faith, patience, and submission to divine will. The suffering was real but purposeful, a furnace in which spiritual impurities were burned away, leaving the soul purified and closer to God. This model was psychologically gentler than the punishment model. It did not require the sufferer to be guilty of anything, but it placed an enormous additional burden on them. Not only were they sick, but they were expected to be sick gracefully. To complain was to fail the test. To question why this was happening was to demonstrate insufficient faith. The disease was bad enough. The requirement to experience it as a spiritual gift was something else entirely. The third solution was demonic. The disease was caused not by God, but by the devil or his agents. The sufferer was not guilty, but afflicted, targeted by malevolent spiritual forces for reasons that might include personal vulnerability, proximity to evil influences, or simply the chaotic malice of demons who attacked wherever they found opportunity. This model had significant practical consequences because it implied a specific form of treatment. If the disease was caused by demonic influence, then the treatment was spiritual combat, exorcism, prayer, the intervention of saints whose particular spiritual authority was understood to be effective against the specific demons associated with specific diseases. Saints were assigned specialties. Certain saints were invoked for certain diseases based on a combination of their life stories, the manner of their deaths, and accumulated tradition about which prayers had appeared to be effective in the past. A person with cancer might be advised to pray to Saint Peregrine, who, according to tradition, had himself been cured of a cancerous growth through divine intervention the night before his leg was scheduled to be amputated. The Saint Peregrine story is worth pausing on because it illustrates something important about how these frameworks functioned in practice. The story provided hope. Specifically, it provided a mechanism for hope, not the vague, unfocused hope that things might somehow improve, but a specific, actionable hope. Pray to this saint, perform this devotion, visit this shrine, do these specific things, and there is a precedent, an actual case, where the same things were done and the disease reversed. Whether the original story was literally true is, from a psychological standpoint, less important than the fact that it provided a template for action. Just as Galen's black bile treatments had given physicians and patients something to do, the intercessory saints gave medieval patients something to do. A protocol, a plan, a story in which their own suffering was not meaningless, but was connected to a tradition of suffering that had, in at least one celebrated case, ended in miraculous recovery. The human need for a protocol in the face of catastrophe is not a medieval peculiarity. It is universal. It is happening right now, in this century, in different forms, but driven by the same underlying psychological architecture. The specific content changes. The structure does not. There was also a fourth explanation that existed alongside the theological ones, sometimes in tension with them, sometimes comfortably integrated. It was environmental. Medieval physicians who maintained some continuity with the Greco-Roman medical tradition, particularly in the Islamic world where Galen's texts were preserved and elaborated during the centuries when much of Europe had limited access to them, continued to work within a humoral framework that was at least partly naturalistic. They looked for causes in diet, in air quality, in the balance of environmental factors that influence the body's internal balance. The Islamic physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote about cancer in his encyclopedic medical text, The Canon of Medicine, around the year 1025. His framework was essentially Galenic, black bile as the primary cause, but his clinical observations were more detailed and more careful than Galen's. He described different types of tumors. He noted that some were more dangerous than others. He recorded that certain tumors grew slowly and others quickly. He observed that the disease appeared more frequently in certain body regions. He was still wrong about the cause, but he was accumulating observations, and observations, even when they are embedded in an incorrect framework, have a value that outlasts the framework. The specific things that Avicenna noticed about how tumors behaved, their growth patterns, their tendency to recur, their varying degrees of aggression, were genuine data points that would, eventually, centuries later, be integrated into frameworks that actually worked. The observations were waiting for the right theory. They waited a long time. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, the theological and medical frameworks existed side by side, sometimes comfortably and sometimes not. A person diagnosed with a cancerous growth might receive advice from both a physician and a priest, and the advice might be contradictory. The physician might recommend dietary changes and herbal treatments aimed at reducing black bile. The priest might recommend prayer and pilgrimage and confession of sins. The patient was caught between two explanatory systems, neither of which could actually help them, both of which offered the illusion of agency. The illusion mattered. It was not nothing. A person who believed their suffering had meaning, whether the meaning was punishment or testing or demonic attack, was a person who could organize their experience into a narrative. And a narrative, even a wrong one, is a container for pain that is slightly more bearable than raw, uncontained pain. The medieval frameworks were containers. They held the pain in shapes that the era could recognize and respond to. The shapes were wrong. The holding was real. In 1779, the first cancer hospital in history opened in Reims, France. It closed almost immediately, not because of funding problems or administrative failures or lack of patience. It closed because the people who lived near it were terrified. They believed cancer was contagious. They believed that the air around cancer patients carried the disease, that it seeped through walls and drifted through windows and settled on the skin and clothing of anyone who came too close. They petitioned the city government to shut the hospital down before it infected the entire neighborhood. The city government agreed. The hospital was relocated outside the city walls. This was not an isolated incident. The contagion theory of cancer was one of the most persistent and most consequential wrong ideas in the history of the disease. It appeared independently in multiple countries. It influenced public health policy. It shaped how patients were treated, not medically, but socially, determining who would care for them and who would refuse to be in the same room with them. The theory had a certain surface plausibility. Cancer often appeared in clusters. A woman would develop a tumor, and then her sister, and then a neighbor. The cluster looked like transmission. It looked like something passing from person to person, the way smallpox passed, the way plague passed. The logical conclusion, given the available evidence, was that cancer was a disease you could catch. The conclusion was wrong, but the observation underneath it was not entirely meaningless. cancer does sometimes cluster in families for genetic reasons that would not be understood for another 2 centuries. It does sometimes cluster geographically for environmental reasons, shared exposure to carcinogenic substances that would also take centuries to identify. The clusters were real. The explanation was wrong. This is a pattern we have seen before. Accurate observations connected by inaccurate causal stories. The medieval physicians saw the same pattern with black bile. The Renaissance physicians saw it with lymphatic blockages. Now the 18th century physicians were seeing it with contagion. The observations accumulate. The stories keep changing. The contagion theory was eventually undermined by a simple and rather courageous experiment. In 1808, a French physician named Jean-Louis Alibert took fluid from the tumor of a breast cancer patient and injected it under his own skin in front of an audience of medical students. He did not develop cancer. Neither did several volunteers who participated in subsequent similar experiments over the following decades. The contagion theory lost its empirical foundation, though it persisted in popular belief for considerably longer than it persisted in medical thinking. The fear of cancer as something you could catch lingered well into the 20th century in some communities, shaping how patients were isolated and stigmatized in ways that had nothing to do with medical reality. But as the contagion theory faded among physicians, something else took its place. Something stranger, and in some ways more damaging: the emotional theory of cancer. The idea that cancer was caused by emotional states, particularly grief, melancholy, anxiety, and the suppression of strong feelings, was not new to the 18th century. It had roots in the humoral tradition, which had always linked black bile to melancholic temperament. But in the 18th and especially the 19th century, the emotional theory took on a new and more specific form. It became personal. The humoral theory had been relatively impersonal. An excess of black bile was a physiological condition, something that happened to your body. The emotional theory shifted the cause from your body to yourself, your personality, your emotional habits, your character. Physicians began to describe a cancer personality. The cancer-prone individual was, according to this theory, someone who experienced strong emotions but suppressed them. Someone who suffered loss but did not grieve openly. Someone who carried anxiety and resentment internally rather than expressing them. Someone who was, in the language of the era, too controlled, too contained, too unwilling to release the emotional pressures that built up inside the human psyche. The pressure, unexpressed, turned inward and manifested as disease. This theory was articulated with considerable sophistication by physicians who genuinely believed they were observing a real pattern. They noted that cancer patients were often people who had experienced significant emotional losses, bereavement, financial ruin, the end of important relationships in the years before their diagnosis. They collected case histories that supported the pattern. They published papers linking specific emotional events to subsequent cancer development. The pattern they observed was, to some extent, real, not because grief causes cancer, but because grief and cancer are both common human experiences that frequently co-occur simply by statistical probability. If you interview any group of seriously ill people about difficult events in their recent past, most of them will have experienced some. Not because the events caused the illness, but because difficult events are a normal part of human life, and most people have experienced some recently at any given time. The physicians of the 18th and 19th centuries did not have the statistical tools to recognize this error. The concept of correlation versus causation, which seems obvious to modern readers, was not formalized until the 20th century. The physicians were seeing a genuine correlation and interpreting it as causation, which is exactly the mistake that the human brain is designed to make, and that modern scientific methodology was specifically developed to prevent. But the emotional theory did something worse than being wrong. It blamed the patient. If cancer was caused by emotional suppression, then the patient had caused their own disease by failing to manage their emotional life correctly. If they had grieved more openly, expressed their anger, released their anxiety, they might not be sick. The disease was, in this framework, a failure of emotional self-management. This was devastating. A person already dealing with a terrifying diagnosis was now also dealing with the implication that they had brought it on themselves, that their personality was the problem, that some fundamental aspect of who they were, their temperament, their way of processing emotion, their basic psychological architecture, had produced the disease that was now threatening their life. The emotional theory of cancer persisted, in various forms, well into the 20th century. It appeared in popular psychology. It appeared in self-help books. It appeared in the advice given to cancer patients by well-meaning friends and family members who suggested that a more positive attitude might help, that letting go of old resentments might make a difference, that the disease was, in some sense, a message from the body about unresolved emotional business. It was wrong every single time. Cancer is caused by genetic mutations in cells that cause them to grow without the normal controls. It is not caused by sadness. It is not caused by suppressed anger. It is not caused by personality type or emotional style or the failure to grieve properly after a loss. But the emotional theory lasted as long as it did because it served the same psychological function that every previous wrong theory had served. It made the disease meaningful. And meaningful was survivable in a way that meaningless was not. Meanwhile, in the practical world of treatment, the 19th century saw the rise of surgery as the primary intervention for cancer, driven by two developments that changed what was physically possible. The first was anesthesia, which arrived in the 1840s. Before anesthesia, surgery was limited by the patient's ability to endure pain. Operations had to be fast. Precision was secondary to speed. A surgeon who could remove a tumor in 90 seconds was preferable to one who took 5 minutes, regardless of the relative quality of their work, because every additional second was a second of agony that the patient might not survive. Anesthesia changed this equation entirely. Surgery could now take as long as it needed to take. Surgeons could be careful. They could be thorough. They could take the time to examine the margins of a tumor and attempt to remove all of it rather than just the most accessible parts. The second development was antisepsis, the understanding that infections were caused by microorganisms and could be prevented through cleanliness. Joseph Lister's introduction of antiseptic surgical techniques in the 1860s reduced the death rate from surgery dramatically. Operations that had previously killed a significant percentage of patients through post-surgical infection became survivable. These two developments together, anesthesia and antisepsis, created the possibility of cancer surgery as we would recognize it today. Surgeons could operate carefully, thoroughly, and with reasonable confidence that the patient would survive the operation itself. The results were mixed. Some patients were cured. Tumors that had not spread, that were contained in a single location and could be completely removed, did not come back. This was genuine, verifiable progress. The first time in the entire history of the disease that a medical intervention had produced consistent, positive outcomes. Other patients were not cured. The tumor came back, or it had already spread to locations that the surgeon could not reach, or the surgery itself, despite the new antiseptic techniques, produced complications that proved fatal. The surgeons responded to the failures in a way that was understandable, but ultimately misguided. They concluded that the failures were caused by insufficient surgery. They had not cut enough. They had not gone deep enough. They had not removed. They had not removed enough surrounding tissue. The solution was to cut more. Operations became more extensive. More tissue was removed. Larger margins were taken. The logic was simple and intuitive. If the tumor came back because some of it was left behind, then remove more, and it would not come back. This logic produced operations of extraordinary scope, procedures that removed not just the tumor, but large amounts of surrounding tissue, nearby lymph nodes, and sometimes entire organs that appeared uninvolved, but might, theoretically, harbor invisible disease. These radical surgeries helped some patients. They harmed others. The difficulty was distinguishing in advance which patients would benefit and which would not, because the understanding of how and why cancer spread was still incomplete. But the fact that surgery worked at all, even some of the time, was a breakthrough of enormous significance. For the first time in 35 centuries, the line drawn by the Egyptian physician had moved. The line between treatable and untreatable had shifted. Not far, not for everyone, not consistently, but it had moved. In 1543, a man named Andreas Vesalius cut open a human body and looked inside. This was not the first time anyone had done this. Dissection had been practiced sporadically in the ancient world and had continued in various forms through the medieval period. But Vesalius did something that his predecessors had not done consistently or systematically. He looked at what was actually there. And then he compared what was actually there to what the textbooks said should be there. The textbooks were Galen's. Galen, who had been the supreme authority in Western medicine for 14 centuries, had based much of his anatomical work on the dissection of animals, primarily barberine macaques and pigs, because the dissection of human bodies was restricted in the Roman world where he practiced. He had then extrapolated from animal anatomy to human anatomy, and in many cases, the extrapolation was close enough to be useful. In many cases, it was not. Vesalius found the discrepancies. Bones that were shaped differently than Galen described, organs that were positioned differently, structures that Galen said existed that simply were not there. And here is the thing that matters for our story. Among the things that were not there, not in the way that Galen described, were the reservoirs of black bile. The humoral system required black bile to be a real, physical substance that existed in measurable quantities in the human body. It was supposed to be produced by the spleen, circulated through the blood, and accumulated in specific locations where it caused disease. The entire theory of cancer, the theory that had dominated medical thinking for 2,000 years, depended on this substance being physically present and physically identifiable. Vesalius could not find it, not in the quantities that the theory required, not in the locations where the theory said it should be, not as a distinct, separable fluid that could be pointed to and measured and identified as the cause of the dark masses that appeared in diseased bodies. This should have been the end of the humoral theory. It was not. Because a theory that has been believed for 2,000 years does not die when it is contradicted by evidence. It adapts. It explains away the contradiction. It adjusts itself just enough to accommodate the new information without collapsing entirely. The humoral physicians of the 16th and 17th centuries performed what amounted to a slow, dignified retreat. They modified the theory. Perhaps black bile was not a visible fluid, but a more subtle substance. Perhaps it was present in quantities too small to observe directly, but potent enough to cause disease at a cellular level. Perhaps the spleen processed it in ways that Galen had not fully understood, and the actual mechanism was more complex than the original theory had suggested. These modifications were not dishonest. The physicians who proposed them were not cynics defending a theory they knew was wrong. They were intelligent people doing what intelligent people do when a framework they depend on begins to show cracks. They repair the cracks. They reinforce the weak points. They keep the structure standing as long as possible, because the structure is not just a theory, it is the foundation of their practice, their training, their understanding of what they do and why it works. A physician who abandoned the humoral theory in 1560 had nothing to replace it with. Nothing. The new anatomy that Vesalius was providing was descriptive, not explanatory. It could tell you what the body looked like inside. It could not tell you why disease happened. It could map structures, but it could not explain mechanisms. It was a catalogue without a theory. And a catalogue without a theory is, for a practicing physician who needs to help a patient today, essentially useless. So they held on to the humours. They held on while the evidence accumulated against them, slowly and from multiple directions simultaneously. Paracelsus, the Swiss physician and alchemist, who was a contemporary of Vesalius, attacked the humoral theory from a different angle entirely. He proposed that diseases were caused not by internal imbalances, but by external agents, specific substances in the environment that entered the body and caused specific diseases. He was thinking in terms of chemistry rather than fluids, and while his specific theories were mostly wrong, his fundamental insight that disease came from outside rather than from an internal imbalance was a conceptual breakthrough that pointed in the direction of eventual truth. Paracelsus was also, by all accounts, extremely difficult to work with. He publicly burned Galen's and Avicenna's texts. He insulted his colleagues. He moved from city to city, partly because he kept making enemies in each one. His personality made it easy for the medical establishment to dismiss his ideas, along with his behavior. And they did, for about a century. But the ideas did not go away. They sat in the background, alongside the crumbling humoral theory, alongside the new anatomy, alongside the theological explanations that continued to operate in parallel, creating a period of genuine intellectual confusion about what cancer actually was. The 17th century was, for cancer theory, a time of multiple simultaneous wrong answers, with no consensus about which wrong answer was least wrong. Some physicians still held to the humoral framework, modified and reinforced, but essentially intact. Some had adopted Paracelsian ideas about external chemical agents. Some had developed mechanical theories, influenced by the new physics of Galileo and Newton, proposing that tumors were caused by blockages or pressures in the body's fluid systems, essentially a plumbing problem. The mechanical theory is worth examining because it shows how the dominant intellectual framework of each era shaped how cancer was understood, regardless of the actual evidence. In the 17th century, the exciting new idea was mechanism. The universe was a machine. The body was a machine. Everything that happened could be explained through the interaction of physical forces operating on physical matter. This was thrilling and productive, and it generated enormous advances in physics and astronomy and engineering. Applied to cancer, it produced the idea that tumors were essentially blockages. Lymph, the clear fluid that circulates through the body's lymphatic system, had been recently discovered and was the exciting new anatomical finding of the era. The theory proposed that lymph could become blocked, stagnant, and eventually corrupted, forming masses that grew as more lymph accumulated behind the blockage. This was wrong, but notice the pattern. The era of fluids produced a fluid theory of cancer. The era of theology produced a theological theory of cancer. The era of mechanics produced a mechanical theory of cancer. Each era used its most prestigious and most successful intellectual framework to explain the thing it could not actually explain. And each time, the framework was sophisticated enough to produce an explanation that sounded plausible within its own terms. Cancer was a mirror. It reflected back whatever framework was pointed at it, because the disease itself was complex enough and variable enough and poorly enough understood that almost any coherent theory could find some evidence to support it. Dark tumors supported the black bile theory. Tumors near lymph nodes supported the lymph theory. Tumors in people who had been exposed to particular environmental conditions supported the chemical theory. The disease was so multifaceted that every theory could find the face it was looking for. This is not unique to cancer. This is what happens whenever a genuinely complex phenomenon is examined by people who have strong theoretical commitments and limited data. The theory shapes what you see. It tells you which observations are significant and which are noise. It organizes the evidence in ways that confirm its own premises. Scientists call this confirmation bias. It is not a medieval failing. It is a human failing, present in every era, managed but never eliminated by the methodological safeguards that modern science has developed specifically to counteract it. The medieval physicians saw black bile because they were looking for black bile. The mechanical physicians saw blockages because they were looking for blockages. The chemical physicians saw toxins because they were looking for toxins. They were all looking at the same disease. They were all seeing different things. And the disease, indifferent to all of their theories, continued to do what it had always done. It grew. It spread. It did not care what anyone called it, or what anyone thought caused it. It was waiting, with the patience of a thing that has no mind, and therefore no impatience, for someone to see it clearly. That would take another 200 years. In 1895, a German physicist named Wilhelm Röntgen was working with cathode rays in his laboratory in Würzburg when he noticed something that should not have been happening. A fluorescent screen on the other side of the room was glowing. The screen was too far from the cathode ray tube to be activated by the rays themselves, which were known to travel only short distances. Something else was reaching it. Something that could pass through the air, across the room, through the glass of the tube, through materials that should have blocked it. Röntgen did not know what it was. He called it X radiation. The X stood for unknown. Within weeks, he had produced the most famous medical image in history, a photograph of his wife, Anna Bertha's hand, showing the bones clearly visible inside the flesh, her wedding ring floating around the finger like a dark halo. When she saw it, she reportedly said she was looking at her own death. She was being dramatic. She was also, in a way she could not have known, being prophetic, because X-rays would turn out to be both one of the most powerful tools ever developed for finding cancer and, in a cruel irony that would take decades to fully understand, a cause of cancer themselves. But that came later. What came first was the immediate, intoxicating realization that for the first time in human history, physicians could see inside a living human body without cutting it open. The impact on cancer diagnosis was revolutionary and almost instantaneous. Within 2 years of Röntgen's discovery, physicians were using X-rays to locate tumors that could not be felt through the skin. Masses that had previously been invisible until surgery were now visible on a photographic plate. The interior of the body, which had been accessible only through the violence of the scalpel, was suddenly available for examination through a process that was painless and, as far as anyone knew at the time, harmless. That last part was wrong, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. The second discovery came in 1898, when Marie Curie and her husband Pierre isolated a new element from pitch-blende ore. They called it radium. It was intensely radioactive, emitting energy continuously and apparently without limit, glowing in the dark with a blue-white light that Marie Curie found beautiful enough to keep a vial of it on her bedside table. She would die of aplastic anemia in 1934, almost certainly caused by decades of radiation exposure. Her personal notebooks are still so radioactive that they are kept in lead-lined boxes, and researchers who wish to consult them must wear protective clothing. But in 1898, none of this was known. What was known, almost immediately, was that radium did something remarkable to living tissue. It destroyed it. Not all tissue equally, but selectively. Rapidly dividing cells were more vulnerable to radiation damage than slowly dividing cells. And cancer cells, which were defined precisely by their rapid, uncontrolled division, were among the most vulnerable of all. This observation, made independently by several researchers in the first years of the 20th century, was the foundation of radiation therapy. If radiation could selectively destroy rapidly dividing cells, and if cancer was a disease of rapidly dividing cells, then radiation could, in theory, destroy cancer while leaving normal tissue relatively intact. The theory was approximately right. The practice was considerably more complicated. The early radiation therapists had no way to precisely control the dose of radiation they were delivering. They had no way to focus it accurately on the tumor while sparing surrounding tissue. They had no way to measure the cumulative damage that repeated exposures caused. They were working with a tool of enormous power and almost no precision, like performing surgery with a broadsword. Some patients were helped. Tumors shrank. Cancers that had been inoperable became operable after radiation reduced their size. Some patients were cured entirely, particularly those with cancers that were highly sensitive to radiation and localized enough to be targeted. Other patients were harmed. Radiation burns, damage to healthy tissue, secondary cancers caused by the radiation itself appearing years or decades after treatment in patients who had been cured of their original disease, only to develop a new one created by the cure. The early 20th century was learning, through painful trial and error, something that would become one of the central principles of oncology. Cancer treatment is always a negotiation with damage. Every treatment that is powerful enough to kill cancer cells is also powerful enough to harm the patient. The goal is not to eliminate damage, but to direct it, to ensure that more damage falls on the disease than on the person carrying the disease. This negotiation is never perfect. The margins are always narrow. The cost is always real. But even as surgery and radiation were beginning to offer the first genuinely effective treatments, something more fundamental was happening in laboratories that would change not just how cancer was treated, but how it was understood. The cell theory of cancer was emerging, and it was terrifying. Not in the way that the old theories had been terrifying. The humoral theory was frightening because it described an imbalance that might be impossible to correct. The demonic theory was frightening because it described an enemy that could not be seen. The contagion theory was frightening because it described a threat that could come from anywhere. The cell theory was frightening because of where the threat came from. It came from inside. The German pathologist Rudolf Virchow had proposed in the 1850s that all cells come from other cells. This was one of the foundational insights of modern biology, but applied to cancer, it meant something deeply unsettling. Cancer cells were not invaders. They were not foreign substances that had entered the body from outside. They were not imbalances of fluid, or visitations of evil, or environmental contaminants that had lodged in the tissue. They were the body's own cells. Cells that had been normal. Cells that had performed their functions correctly, that had divided on schedule, that had cooperated with surrounding cells in the intricate choreography that keeps a living organism functioning. And then, for reasons that early 20th century science could observe but not yet fully explain, those cells had changed. They had stopped following the rules. They had begun dividing without restraint, growing without purpose, consuming resources without contributing to the organism, expanding into territories that did not belong to them. The metaphors that people reached for were political. Cancer cells were rebels, outlaws, citizens of the body that had broken their social contract and reverted to a kind of primitive selfishness, consuming and expanding without regard for the community they had once been part of. These metaphors were imprecise, but they captured something emotionally true about why cancer was so uniquely disturbing. It was betrayal. Not betrayal by an enemy, betrayal by self. The body turning against itself. The cells that were supposed to protect and maintain and sustain the organism, instead becoming its destroyers. The threat was not external. It could not be walled out, or washed away, or avoided through better hygiene or purer living. It emerged from within, from the same biological processes that produced health, using the same cellular machinery that built the body in the first place. This was conceptually devastating. Every previous theory of cancer had, in its own way, offered a boundary between the patient and the disease. The disease was an imbalance to be corrected, or a spiritual affliction to be healed, or an invader to be repelled, or a contaminant to be removed. In each case, the patient was on one side, and the disease was on the other. The cell theory dissolved that boundary. The patient was the disease, or rather, the disease was made of the patient. It was the patient's own cells, carrying the patient's own DNA, using the patient's own biological systems, hiding in plain sight among the body's trillions of normal cells, because it was, at a fundamental level, made of the same material. This understanding, which solidified through the first half of the 20th century as microscopy and cellular biology advanced, was the most important conceptual breakthrough in the history of cancer. It was also the hardest to accept, because it meant that cancer was not something that happened to the body. It was something the body did. The search for why it did this, for the specific mechanisms that turned a normal cell into a cancerous one, would drive the next century of research. The answers would involve genes and mutations and environmental triggers and inherited vulnerabilities and viral infections and a level of biological complexity that no previous era could have imagined. But the fundamental insight was established. The enemy was inside. It had always been inside. And every previous theory, from the black bile of Hippocrates to the emotional suppression of the Victorians, had been, in its own way, an attempt to avoid confronting this deeply uncomfortable fact by placing the cause somewhere else. Somewhere outside, somewhere removable, somewhere that was not self. The 20th century removed that comfort and replaced it with something better. Understanding. There is a particular kind of courage that does not look like courage. It does not involve battlefields or burning buildings or dramatic acts of physical bravery that can be photographed and celebrated and remembered in speeches. It is quieter than that, less visible, easier to miss entirely unless you know what you are looking for. It is the courage to say, "I do not know." This sounds simple. It is not simple. It is, in fact, one of the most difficult things a human being can do, particularly a human being who has been asked for help by someone who is frightened and in pain and looking to them for answers. The Egyptian physician who wrote "There is no treatment" on his papyrus 35 centuries ago was demonstrating this courage. He had been trained in a medical tradition that provided explanations for most of the conditions he encountered. He had remedies and protocols and frameworks for understanding disease. And then he encountered something that his entire system could not accommodate, and instead of forcing an explanation that did not fit, he drew a line. Here is what I know. Here is what I do not know. I will not pretend the second category is smaller than it actually is. This is where the story of cancer begins, and, in a sense, it is where every meaningful story in the history of human knowledge begins, with someone honest enough to admit the boundary of their understanding, and someone else stubborn enough to push that boundary a little further, and someone else after that, across generations and centuries and millennia, each one pushing a little further than the person before them. The wrong answers were part of this process. This is the thing that is hardest to see when you look back at the history of how people explained cancer to themselves. The wrong answers look, from our comfortable distance, like failures, like dead ends, like time wasted believing things that were not true, while people suffered and died from a disease that the wrong beliefs could not help them survive. And that is partly accurate. The wrong answers did fail. People did suffer. The treatments based on humoral theory and emotional suppression and spiritual purification did not work, and the people who received them were not helped, and many of them were actively harmed by interventions that ranged from useless to brutal. This is true, but it is not the whole truth, because the wrong answers also did something else. They kept the question alive. Every physician who proposed a theory of cancer, from Hippocrates with his black bile, to Galen with his dietary protocols, to the medieval theologians with their models of divine punishment, to the Victorian doctors with their theories of emotional suppression. Every single one of them was doing something that mattered, even when their specific conclusions did not. They were paying attention. They were looking at the disease, recording its behavior, noting its patterns, describing what it did, even when they could not explain why it did it. They were accumulating observations, slowly and imperfectly, in frameworks that were wrong, but that organized the observations well enough to preserve them and transmit them to the next generation. The observations outlived the frameworks. This is the crucial point. The frameworks were temporary. Black bile came and went. Humoral theory came and went. The contagion theory came and went. The emotional theory came and went. Each framework served its era and then dissolved as better frameworks emerged. But the observations, the raw data of what cancer actually looked like and how it actually behaved, those survived every theoretical transition. Hippocrates noted that cutting into tumors often made them worse. That observation was correct, and it remained useful for centuries, regardless of the theoretical framework it was embedded in. Avicenna noted that different tumors had different growth rates. That observation was correct, and it eventually became part of the modern understanding of cancer grading and staging. The 18th century physicians who noted that cancer appeared in geographical clusters were making an observation that would eventually lead to the identification of environmental carcinogens. The observations accumulated like sediment, layer by layer, era by era, wrong theory by wrong theory. And eventually, when the right theoretical framework arrived, the framework of cellular biology and genetics and molecular science, the observations were waiting for it. Centuries of careful watching, embedded in centuries of wrong explanations, suddenly became usable. The raw data that had been collected under the banner of black bile and divine punishment and emotional suppression was reinterpreted, reorganized, and integrated into an understanding that actually worked. Nothing was wasted. Not entirely. Even the most wrong theories contributed something, if only the elimination of a possibility that someone else would not need to waste time testing again. This is how knowledge works. Not as a straight line from ignorance to understanding, not as a series of clean breakthroughs by solitary geniuses who see what no one before them could see, but as a slow, messy, communal process of accumulation and error and correction, carried forward by thousands of people across thousands of years, most of whom were wrong about the specific thing they believed, but right about the general principle that the question was worth asking and the answer was worth pursuing. The people who believed in black bile were wrong, but they were not wasting their time. They were part of a process that was larger than any individual era's understanding, a process that could not see its own shape from the inside, a process that looked like failure from any single vantage point within it, but that looked, from sufficient distance, like the slow emergence of truth from the accumulated residue of error. There is something profoundly hopeful about this. Not hopeful in the easy, comfortable sense. The history of cancer treatment is not a comfortable story. The suffering was real. The failed treatments were real. The people who died while the question was still being answered were real. And their deaths are not redeemed by the fact that later generations eventually found better answers. But hopeful in a deeper sense. Hopeful because the story demonstrates something about the human species that is genuinely remarkable. We did not give up. 35 centuries, hundreds of wrong answers, millions of deaths from a disease that resisted every explanation and every treatment that was thrown at it. And at no point, in no era, in no culture, did the collective human response become, "This cannot be understood, and we should stop trying." The Egyptian physician wrote, "There is no treatment." He did not write, "There will never be a treatment." The line he drew was a line in the present, not a wall across the future. And every generation that came after him understood this, implicitly or explicitly. The line was not a boundary of human capability. It was a marker of current position. It said, "We are here." It did not say, "We will always be here." The stubbornness is breathtaking when you see it clearly, generation after generation, looking at the same disease, trying the same wrong approaches and new wrong approaches and slightly less wrong approaches, accumulating knowledge so slowly that no single generation could perceive the progress, passing their observations forward to the next generation in the hope that someone, eventually, would know what to do with them. That is not failure. That is one of the most extraordinary things our species has ever done. And it is still happening, right now, today, in laboratories and hospitals and research institutions around the world. People are asking the same question that the Egyptian physician asked 35 centuries ago. What is this thing? Why does it happen? What can we do about it? The answers are better now, immeasurably better. The understanding of cancer at the genetic and molecular level has advanced more in the last 50 years than in the entire previous history of the disease. Treatments exist now that would have seemed miraculous to physicians of any previous era. Survival rates for many cancers have improved dramatically. Some cancers that were uniformly fatal within living memory are now curable. The line has moved. It has moved further in the last century than in all the preceding centuries combined. But it has not reached the end. There are still cancers that resist treatment. There are still questions without answers. There are still patients who receive the same devastating news that patients have received for millennia, delivered in gentler language and with more options, but carrying the same fundamental weight. The line is still a line, and there are still people pushing it. They are pushing it with tools that the Egyptian physician could not have imagined: genomic sequencing and immunotherapy and targeted molecular treatments and artificial intelligence that can analyze patterns in datasets too large for any human mind to process. The tools are extraordinary. The sophistication is extraordinary. But the impulse underneath the tools is the same impulse that drove the Egyptian physician to pick up his reed pen and record, carefully and precisely, what he observed in a patient he could not help. The impulse to pay attention, to write it down, to refuse to look away from the thing that cannot yet be understood. To say, honestly and without false comfort, here is what we know, and here is what we do not know, and the distance between those two things is where the work happens. The work has been happening for 35 centuries. It has not stopped. It will not stop. Because the question is too important, and the human mind is too stubborn, and the accumulation of knowledge, slow as it is, messy as it is, wrong as it frequently is along the way, has a direction. The direction is forward, always forward, even when it does not feel like forward, even when the current era's best theory turns out to be wrong, and the current era's best treatment turns out to be harmful, and the current era's most confident experts turn out to be mistaken in ways that will seem obvious to their grandchildren. Even then, forward. The Egyptian physician drew a line on papyrus 35 centuries ago. The line is still there. It is in a different place now. It will be in a different place tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. This is what we do. We push the line. It is the most human thing there is.